Good morning, everyone. We are going to do the rest of the digestive system today, and per usual, like we're in class, I will go through the slides that we covered in the previous class on Thursday, and then cover new stuff. Get to the end of this, leaving for Thursday the excretory system, as well as the reproductive system, what we can get through. So we will have covered the entire body by the end of this class, which is wonderful. When you're studying for the exam, it will be a good idea to go back through all of the lectures and look at the goals and objectives and really just see how these fit together to form a holistic picture of the human body and how they work together to enable our physiology. So remember, the digestive system allows us to ingest and digest material. You have multiple layers of tissue, which are the mucosa, all the way deep, full of different structures that allow it to increase surface area. Underneath that, or more superficial to that, you have the submucosa, then the muscularis externa, and all the way on the outside of these tubes, you have the serosa, which is either the peritoneum or in the esophagus, the adventitia. In the mucosa, you have epithelial tissue. So what you're doing is secreting, absorbing, or in the case of the mouth, protecting, increasing surface area. And then you have your lamina propria, which is just adjacent to the submucosa. This is dense connective tissue full of vasculature, nervous tissue, which forms the plexus of Meissner, or the submucosal plexus, as we like to say. No sympathetic fibers here. And all this does is moves these little plica and these little villi around. External to that, you have the muscularis externa, smooth and longitudinal muscles. And this is innervated by the plexus of Auerbach, or the myenteric plexus. Sympathetic fibers do run in here. The serosa is all the way external, just like any tube. It's covered in connective tissue. Below the diaphragm, it's a membrane, so there's epithelial tissue to secrete that serous fluid. And above the diaphragm, it's simply fibrous connective tissue, the adventitia. All of the muscles in the digestive system are smooth muscles. Now this is below the pharynx. Smooth muscles are autoregulatory. The circular layers will contract, followed by the longitudinal layers, and this process repeats to perform peristalsis, which is just the function by which food is moved through the digestive system, and segmentation. These muscle contractions can be pretty harsh and segment our food into tiny little boluses, or boli, that are easy to digest. Remember, in the autonomic nervous system, we have short reflexes, which don't even go to the spine, they just go to those ganglia, and then long reflexes, which go into the spine but not to the brain. The peritoneum is a membrane. It's a serous membrane, so you have two layers, just like in the pericardium, just like in the pleural sac. A visceral layer and a parietal layer external to the organs. You have intraperitoneal organs, retroperitoneal organs, and secondary retroperitoneal organs. The retroperitoneal organs are outside of the peritoneum. Secondarily, retroperitoneal organs are also outside of the peritoneum, but they started out inside and then during embryonic development grew outside. The peritoneum is a serous membrane that surrounds the entire digestive system here, below the diaphragm. It starts right here, just under the diaphragm, and continues down, forming the lesser omentum that connects the stomach to the liver, the greater omentum. And this greater omentum is a curtain that hangs in front of all of your intestines, that holds fat, holds lymph, and then also provides some protection. The oral cavity is made of stratified squamous epithelial tissue. In the mouth, you have mechanical, by the teeth and all the muscles, and chemical digestion. Remember, you have both lingual lipase and amylase. The vestibule is the area between your teeth and your lips. The gingiva is another name for your gums. You've probably all heard of gingivitis. The hard palate is the palatine bone. Behind that in your mouth is the soft palate. You have two arches, and between those arches you have tonsils. The arches are your palatoglossal and palatopharyngeal. The fauces is the entrance to the pharynx back here, and remember your tongue has multiple muscles and multiple cranial nerves that control it. On the tongue you have papillae. These are very prominent in the cat, not so much in the human, but we do still use them for friction, and then our taste buds are on these papillae. We make lingual lipase. The frenulum holds the tongue inferiorly. You have intrinsic and extrinsic muscles. Review the muscles to know sheet. Finally, these salivary glands, which are innervated by the facial nerve. A synapomorphy of mammals, remember, is heterodont teeth. That's different types of teeth. Only mammals have this, and humans are mammals, so we have these. Incisors for cutting, canines for piercing, bicuspids for grinding, and molars for grinding. If you compare the teeth of a human to the teeth of a cat to the teeth of a horse, you can really see the specialization of these different types of teeth that has led to allow mammals to fill so many niches. The pharyngeal muscles, you have pharyngeal constrictors, which are skeletal muscles, innervated by the somatic nervous system, stimulate deglutition, which is swallowing. These are voluntary and involuntary, but remember, because they're skeletal muscle, this is not the autonomic nervous system. This is just medullary innervation, not cortical innervation of these muscles. As you move from the pharynx to the esophagus, you go through the diaphragm at a hole called the esophageal hiatus. At the lower esophagus, you have the cardiac sphincter, which leads into the stomach. Superiorly in the esophagus, you have stratified squamous cells. You have expanding plica, which allows the esophagus to grow in diameter. You can see the transverse section of the esophagus right here. You have submucosal glands that provide a lubrication. Muscularis externa. Superiorly, it's skeletal. Inferiorly, it's smooth, but the entire length of the esophagus is surrounded just by fibrous connective tissue. This is not a serous membrane, called the adventitia. Moving further inferiorly to the stomach. This is the site of major mechanical digestion and major chemical digestion, which creates chyme, which is a mix of all of these enzymes and all of this acid in the stomach and the food. You have multiple regions of the stomach. Here's the esophagus, the cardiac sphincter, an area of the stomach here superiorly called the fundus. This is the cardia, the pylorus, and then the major body. This is the greater omentum hanging down. The spleen right here, the beginning of the duodenum. The two curves of the stomach are known as the greater curve or the greater curvature of the stomach and the lesser curve or the lesser curvature of the stomach. You have three layers, a longitudinal, a circular, and then deep you have this sparse layer of muscle called the oblique muscular layer. This allows the stomach to really churn and grind up food. And then inside you have little things called rugae, which are just folds in the skin, and these are distendable so that your stomach is able to hold lots of food. Remember, the stomach is surrounded by the peritoneum, and here's the most inner layer, the deepest layer, the mucosal sheet. It is filled with gastric pits that have multiple types of cells. The mucous neck cells provide mucus that protects the stomach from the acid that the parietal cells are secreting. It also lubricates the stomach and allows it to really move around and the food to slide across it. Like I said, the parietal cells secrete hydrochloric acid and something called intrinsic factor, which is a ligand that promotes digestion. The chief cells in these gastric pits make pepsin, which starts out as pepsinogen and is converted to pepsin, and this is a digestive enzyme. In infants, these cells make renin and lipase, which help to digest milk. You also have enteroendocrine cells. Entero meaning digestion, endocrine meaning they release ligands that go into the blood. They release hormones. Enteroendocrine cells are making primarily gastrin, which is a hormone that promotes digestion and other functions of the GI tract. Up here you can see a diagram from your book that shows the transverse histology of the stomach with the gastric pits here. Here's a different view from your book that shows the gastric pit themselves with the different types of cells here, and then a micrograph. Moving past the pyloric sphincter into the small intestine. The small intestine is the primary site of digestion. You have it divided into 3 lengths: the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. And remember, the mesenteries hold this entire structure in place. The bile duct and pancreatic duct provide the digestive enzymes at the duodenum. And once again, the vagus and then the sympathetic ganglia innervate the smooth muscle of this structure and the epithelial cells of the structure to promote all of the activity that goes on here. In contrast to the stomach, the plici are fixed in the small intestine. They do not distend at all. The mucosal layer of the small intestine possesses both villi and microvilli, which remember are just extensions of the cell membrane, to increase surface area. This allows these cells to better digest and absorb. You have small crypts, or you can see just here little in-pocketings that provide new cells when these are destroyed. You also have lymphoid cells. Are really interesting. They're called lacteals, and what they do is they provide a mechanism to bypass the hepatic portal system. The lacteals will absorb and take directly into circulation hydrophobic molecules. Finally, you have Peyer's patches, which are congregations of lymphatic tissue. And these contain multiple T cells, natural killer cells, and B cells that protect our bodies from the pathogens that we ingest. Anything that gets through the stomach is then going to be taken care of by the immune system activity coming from these Peyer's patches. As we move past the ileocecal valve into the large intestine, we have completed digestion, and now all we're doing is reabsorbing water and some of the nutrients. The cecum and appendix are the first part of the large intestine, also called the colon. Food then travels up through the ascending colon to the hepatic flexure, across the transverse colon to the splenic flexure, down the descending colon to the sigmoid flexure, and then into the rectum to the anus. All along this line, you have multiple pouches that allow distension again here, like the rugi did in the stomach. And you have a longitudinal layer of muscle called the tinea coli. This contrasts the musculature of the large intestine with the small intestine and the stomach. You do not have a layer of longitudinal muscle covering the entire diameter of the large intestine. The only thing you have is the tinea coli. Remember, all of this is smooth muscle, and this promotes larger movements called mass movement, which doesn't so much do peristalsis or segmentation. What you're doing here is compaction. Compaction and dehydration happens in the large intestine. As you move to the anus, the epithelial tissue changes from columnar to squamous to stratified squamous to keratinized stratified squamous. Because once you get down to the rectum and the terminal end of the colon or large intestine, you have a large, firm bolus of feces that can cause some friction. Finally, you have an internal anal sphincter, which is smooth muscle, and an external anal sphincter, which is skeletal muscle. you have conscious control over the external. You learn to control this when you're 2 or 3 and get out of diapers. The histological arrangement of the large intestine, like I said, it does not promote digestion. You have these crypts full of absorptive cells. It's much thinner and less convoluted. No villi here. You have mucus production, but no enzyme production. Remember, you're not digesting anything here. You have very slow movements, and what you're really doing is reabsorbing mainly all of the water so that you have a nice, tight, compact bolus of feces. Lots and lots of lymphoid tissue here, and this prevents pathogens from getting into the body. When we look at the accessory glands of the digestive system, it includes the liver and the pancreas. You can see the multiple effects of the liver. Hepatocytes, remember hepatic means liver, hepatocytes are the primary cells of the liver that monitor the hepatic portal system blood. They can store or release nutrients. The liver also regulates blood composition, and also this is where you get those proteins for osmoregulation, the albumins, globulins, and fibrinogens. The liver also makes bile, which is a surfactant like soap, and breaks up these large fat globules into tiny little micelles, which increases the surface area to volume ratio, allowing our body to better digest this. This is a whole view of the liver. You can see all of the vasculature here and the major gallbladder. The falciform ligament divides this in half. You have a coronary ligament, which is the first time I've used that term, but it provides superior support, and a round ligament that provides inferior support. And remember that lesser omentum holds the liver to the stomach. This is all just connective tissue. Within the liver, you have hundreds of thousands of lobes full of hepatocytes that monitor the blood and also add things to the blood. Kupffer cells, which are macrophagic cells and absorb heavy metals primarily. These are going to be lead, cadmium, all the great things you get from toys these days. And the hepatic triad, which is formed from the hepatic artery, the hepatic portal vessel, and the bile duct. And this is where bile is going to come from, monitoring the hepatic portal system blood, getting nutrients from the hepatic artery proper, and then the bile ducts combine to form the right and left bile ducts, which combine to form the common hepatic duct. You can see that right here, which then runs down past this juncture into the common bile duct and into the duodenum. Now over here, you have a cystic duct that backs up into the gallbladder. So when you make bile, it comes down here to the common bile duct. If the sphincter of Oddi, which we call the hepatopancreatic sphincter, is closed, it's going to then back up and fill the gallbladder. The gallbladder gets full of bile, which just sits there, which is why you can get gallstones. And remember, there's the 5 F's: female, fertile, fair, 40, and overweight. The gallbladder is a muscular sac. It has a mucosa, a lamina propria, a muscularis externa, and then it's covered in connective tissue. It concentrates bile salts, and it responds to a hormone called cholecystokinin. We talked about this very briefly in lab, but cholecystokinin is a very interesting hormone. But right here what it does is it relaxes the sphincter of Oddi, and it also causes the gallbladder to squeeze. So the enzymes that come from the liver and are held in the gallbladder enter the digestive system at the duodenum right here. And this is just a close-up of the little papilla and the hepatopancreatic sphincter. Moving to the pancreas, it is an exocrine gland that provides all of these different enzymes, as well as sodium bicarbonate to buffer all of the acid from the stomach. You also have islet cells in the pancreas, which are part of the endocrine system that release insulin, glycogen, and somatostatin. We'll cover that when we talk about endocrinology, primarily next year in physiology.